Thank you for joining the Middlebury Public Library's sourdough class. My name is Sarah Rich, and I'm the Adult Services Librarian at the library. And I'm really excited to make sourdough with you guys today because sourdough is something that I really enjoy and am super passionate about. My favorite food is bread, and I've been making sourdough bread for about 6 or 7 years. So, yeah, I'm excited to have you join me. So to start off with, I wanted to give a quick explanation of what sourdough is, because I think a lot of people have a misconception that sourdough is just like a flavor of bread, and it's actually a completely different way of making bread. Sometimes it's pretty sour, but other times it might not be sour, depending on how you make it. Sourdough bread is actually just bread that uses wild yeast captured from the air rather than the kind of typical store-bought yeast that you buy in those packets. That's kind of like a more powdery mixture. So with sourdough, you need to have a starter where your wild yeast can live. So in your packet, I'm including a little starter for all of you that comes from the starter that I started about 6 years ago. So sourdough is actually the oldest kind of leavened bread. It's way, way older than the kind of bread that you buy at the grocery store that's made with this kind of yeast you've probably seen. So sourdough was discovered around 1500 BC in ancient Egypt. And before that, people were still eating bread, but it probably was flat bread that wasn't leavened. And so we think that probably around 1500 BC, somebody probably just accidentally left out some flour and water, that they had used to make bread, and it kind of bubbled up, and they noticed that it sort of rose. And that was from capturing the wild sourdough yeast from the air. And so then after that, for the next basically 3,000 years or more, people have been making sourdough bread. It was only in the 1850s when Louis Pasteur discovered yeast and how to kind of distill it that we started getting the grocery store yeast, which is used commonly today because it is so easy to and quick to make leavened bread. So that's mostly the kind of bread that we eat. Although just in the past couple of decades, there's kind of been a renaissance in sourdough bread as people discover all of the health benefits and kind of rediscover how delicious it can be. Sourdough bread takes a long time to make, and it's kind of an investment. It's almost like having a pet. So why would you even choose to make it? Well, for one thing, sourdough bread is just so delicious. It's like you can't replicate that kind of like sticky crumb and that crusty outside with commercial yeast bread. And for another thing, it is probably healthier than regular yeasted bread. Just the amount of time that it takes to make means that you're able to kind of break down the gluten a little bit more. So a lot of studies have shown that even people with gluten sensitivities, can eat sourdough bread, and it affects them a lot less than yeasted bread. So there's a lot of health benefits to it. So the most essential part of baking sourdough is the starter. So the starter is basically just a mixture of water and flour that also includes two special ingredients. One is the wild yeast that comes from the air around us, and two is the lactobacilli, which is like a bacteria, but it's a good bacteria that makes it sour. So basically how it works is that when you mix the water and the flour together to make the bread, the yeast in the starter converts all of the sugars from the flour into carbon dioxide, which is what produces the bubbles in the starter, or in the bread in general. And that's what makes the bread rise. The lactobacilli lowers the pH of the bread, so that's what kind of gives it that sour flavor. And lowering the pH also helps keep out bad bacteria, which helps make the bread more shelf stable for a longer period of time, and it won't mold as easily. So you can make your own sourdough starter from scratch just by mixing together flour and water. But the great thing about sourdough is that it is very shareable. So I am able to, from my sourdough, divide it out into a bunch of little baby sourdough starters that I'm giving to you. Um, and you can actually keep this starter alive for many, many years. A lot of people say that, their sourdough starters have been passed on from generation to generation. Some sourdough starters are as old as 150 or 200 years old. So as long as you're kind of keeping it in check and taking good care of it, it can really last a long time, which is cool. All right, so I am including in the packet that you'll pick up at the library a sourdough starter for you, as well as some instructions on how to take care of it and the recipe that I use for the sourdough. So how do you take care of your sourdough starter? Well, the first thing is to keep it in a nice wide-mouthed glass jar. So I have this nice big one that I like to use. I think it's like 32 ounces or something like that. But the 16-ounce jar that I gave you should also work. Just remember that when it's active, it's probably going to be like doubling in size. This one is pretty active right now, which is why it's almost to the top of the jar there. Second thing, give your starter a name. So my sourdough starter is named Carl. If you want to, give yours a name like Mini Carl or come up with a completely different name, do it. It's like a pet. So you got to get to know your starter. You got to, start treating it like a living being, which it really is. When you aren't using your starter, you can just store it in the fridge. And actually, you can leave your starter in the fridge for a couple months and it'll be fine. I have left my starter in the fridge without touching it, probably for even like 3 months. And when I come back, sometimes it looks a little bit gross, like it has sort of a film on the top of it, has some like liquid that smells alcoholic because actually it is. And it might look a little bit like green or gray. You just pour off that liquid and you feed it and it'll probably bounce back. Sourdough starters are very good at bouncing back, so it'll probably be fine. The longer that it's dormant, it might start to smell gross, but it should be okay. If your starter has been in the fridge, you'll have to take it out and give it a couple of feedings before baking with it. So maybe like 2 days before you're planning to bake with it, take it out of the fridge and feed it. And to feed it, what you're going to do is pour off, discard all but about half a cup of your starter, and then to the part that you saved, add about half cup of water and around 3/4 cup or so of flour. Stir that around, cover it with plastic wrap, and let it sit at room temperature. And you'll start to notice that it kind of bubbles up throughout the day. So before baking with it, you're going to want to do those feedings twice a day, morning and night. And it'll get real active and bubbly, and it'll be totally ready for you to bake with it. So if you don't want to bake with your starter for a long time, like 4 months or something like that, you don't want to touch it. Just keep it in the fridge for like 2 months and then give it a feeding and then put it back in the fridge. No big deal. I know that it seems wasteful to discard so much of the sourdough starter, but it actually is really essential to the process to do that, just because if you think about it as a living thing, so if I had to like feed all of this, if I had to keep adding flour and water, I would need to add a lot of flour and water. So what I'm going to do is discard a bunch of it, distill it into a smaller quantity, and then feed it a smaller amount of water and flour to kind of keep it alive. So if you don't want to throw it away, however, there are some different recipes that you can make with the sourdough discard, or you can share it with a friend. I like to make sourdough waffles and also sourdough crackers. And I'm going to include a recipe for you for the sourdough waffles. All right, so besides the sourdough starter, there are a couple of basic ingredients that you need to make sourdough bread. It's not a lot, which is the great thing about sourdough. So you need, of course, your starter, and then you'll need some flour. I like to use bread flour, but I didn't get a chance to pick any up this week. It just does a little bit better job of helping it rise and keep its structure, but you can also just use all-purpose flour. And then I also like to use a small quantity of whole wheat flour, but you can also just use white flour too, that's fine. And then you just need salt and water, and that's basically it. There are a few equipment things that it's kind of useful to have to make sourdough. Most of these are optional. So I have a Dutch oven that I really like using. I'll explain why later, but it's really nice to bake it in this Dutch oven. And then I have a proofing basket, which is specially designed for making bread. This is where you let the bread rise. But you can also just use a regular bowl and put a towel in there or something. And then it's nice to have a kitchen scale because a lot of the recipes for sourdough are in weight rather than like cups and stuff like we're used to. And finally, you're just going to want like a sharp knife, or I like to use a razor. So those are kind of the basic things that you need. All right, so there are a lot of sourdough books and blogs and recipes out there, but mostly the general recipe is about the same, like regardless of where you look. So the basic recipe, you can add to it by, increasing the water or adding different kinds of flour like rye or whole wheat. You can add things like nuts or seeds or whatever. But I think it's good to just kind of start out with the basic recipe and go from there. So my favorite recipe and my favorite sourdough book is called Tartine. And it's written by the owners of the famous Tartine Bakery out in California. So I'm including this recipe in your sourdough packet, but feel free to experiment with other recipes too. So I know that the recipe I gave you looks super long and probably kind of daunting, but don't freak out. We're just going to take it step by step. This is a whole day process, so you'll need to set aside some time. But that said, it's a whole day process, but it doesn't actually, it's not that complicated. It's just kind of like being attentive to your dough, coming back every half hour, or whatever to like do something to it. So we'll just take it step by step. Okay, so the night before you're going to bake, what you want to do is make a leaven, which is basically kind of just like your sourdough starter. It's just kind of prepping the sourdough starter to make sure that it's super active for the day of baking. So I already did this last night and I created this leaven. So what you do to make the leaven, and this is in your recipe, you're going to discard all but like a tablespoon of the sourdough starter and add to that 200 grams of water and 200 grams of flour, and stir it together and just kind of like set it in a bowl like this and let it rest overnight at room temperature. So the next morning it should be real bubbly. Let's see how mine is doing. Oh yeah, it's looking nice and bubbly. I don't know if you can see that, but check out those bubbles. It is so ready to go. But just to make sure, what we're going to do is the float test, which basically requires you to fill a cup of water, and then I'm going to put a spoonful of my sourdough starter into the water and hope that it floats. Oh yeah, look at that, it floats. So that basically tells you that your sourdough starter has enough carbon dioxide in it. It's nice and bubbly and ready to go, so you're ready to bake with it. All right, so I've got my nice big bowl that I'm going to bake with, and I have it on my scale here. So first thing I'm going to do is weigh out 200 grams of my sourdough starter. Oh, it's in ounces, not grams. Okay. So let's get a nice even 200 here. All right, and then the rest of the sourdough starter, you're just going to feed this and then kind of continue it as your starter. So I'll just set that aside for now, and then I'll feed it in a second. So to that 200 grams of starter, you add 700 grams of water, and you want the water to be not very hot, but not also super cold. It just kind of helps with the fermentation for it to be kind of lukewarm. I like to think of it as like water that I'd be okay swimming in, like, 80 degrees maybe, something like that. So I'm going to add 700 grams of water here. Weigh it out. Almost there. All right, perfect. All right, so that's going to start to be pretty heavy, and my scale actually cannot handle like really heavy weight. So after I kind of stir this and disperse it, I'm going to measure out the flour in a separate container. But whatever works for you. And by the way, if you don't have a kitchen scale, I have converted these measurements into cups in the recipe. So yeah, if it's easier for you to go by cups, you can do that too. It's just bakers tend to think in weight. All right, so I'm going to set this aside for a sec and weigh out my flour. So the recipe that I'm using is a little bit different, I think, from the recipe I gave you. But what I'm going to do is 900 grams of white flour, and then I think it's just 100 grams of whole wheat flour. And again, like, bread flour is best, but I just didn't have any time to pick it up. So I have my regular all-purpose flour here. It's a lot of flour. This makes a lot of bread. So if you like bread, it's a good thing. All right, that's... Ooh. All right, that's about right. 900, and then about 100 of whole wheat here. And the whole wheat just like kind of, I don't know, gives it a little bit something different. And of course it's healthy. But you also don't need to do whole wheat. Sometimes I just really like straight white bread. But with just 100 grams of whole wheat, it's not going to be super wheaty. All right. So now that I have this measured out, I'm going to add it to my water and starter mix. And just mix it around. It might be a little bit tricky to mix, or it might get kind of like hard to mix with a spoon. So what I do after a little bit, I make sure that my hands are clean, and then I just mix it by hand. And basically at this point, you just want to make sure that you're getting all of the flour wet. So this is pretty much all the ingredients already here. Once I mix this together and make sure that it's all kind of moist all the way through, I am going to let it sit for 25 to 40 minutes. And after that period, I'll add the salt with a little bit of extra water. This step is really essential, that letting it rest. It's called the autolyse, and just letting the flour and water combine before adding the salt kind of helps the gluten bonds start to form. There's something about the salt, I think, that prevents that from happening, or just makes it a little harder. And so it's really essential that you let it rest. So I'm going to give this, I think it's pretty nice and moist. My hands are all doughy, which is sometimes kind of fun. But you can see it's all pretty much mixed together. It looks like a big gloopy mess. And so I'll just let it rest for 25 to 40 minutes, and I'll be back in a sec. Hi, we're back after that wait, and our dough is looking pretty good. So the next step is going to be to add the water and salt. So what I've done already is just measured out 50 grams of water and 20 grams of salt. And the water can be a little bit warm so that the salt dissolves in it. And then, so just stir that around a little bit and then just add it straight to the dough here. And I'm just gonna mix it around a little bit with my hands. It's gonna be pretty like goofy at this point. Make some weird noises over here. But just sort of like mix it with your hands and make some good squirting noises. Sort of squeeze it, get that water incorporated. It'll seem very, very sloppy, but that's actually a good thing. Like the wetter the dough, the tastier the bread is going to be. It's a little bit harder with a really hydrated dough to keep the structure of the bread kind of intact. But as you get a little bit more advanced, you kind of figure out techniques to do that. Because bakers are always aiming for a wetter dough, just because it's like nice to have that really moist crumb on the inside. Anyways, once it's kind of like nice and mixed together, we're gonna start now the bulk fermentation process. This is what it looks like at this stage. It's still a little bit like, I don't know, just sort of like not very smooth, a little bit bumpy looking. But throughout the bulk fermentation, it's going to smooth out and get a lot stretchier. So basically during bulk fermentation, it's a 3-ish hour period where every half hour you're going to do a fold to the dough. So with sourdough, you don't actually do any kneading. Instead, there's this process of folding the dough to kind of stretch out the gluten and get those bonds kind of, stretching. So what you do, you're just going to do a series of folds. It's pretty simple. Just grab one end, pull it up, kind of fold it over. At this point, you can tell it's breaking a little bit because the gluten bonds are not fully developed yet. So I'm just going to do 4 folds, turning the bowl each time, kind of pulling it like that. And then I'm just going to turn it over and let it sit for 30 minutes. Come back at 30 minutes, do it again, and then let it sit again. Basically just repeat this, giving it about 6 folds in around 3 hours. So this is the part where you really need to like be around the house, being attentive to your dough and kind of keeping an eye on the clock every half hour. You have to do these folds. After that, it gets a little bit more hands-off, so don't worry. We'll come back. I'm going to do this a few times, and then towards the end of the bulk fermentation, I'll come back and show you what it looks like. All right, we're back, and the dough has completed its bulk fermentation. So it's been 3 hours of folding every half hour. And at this point, the dough is starting to look really nice. It's like kind of stretchy. When you kind of jiggle it like that, you see how it moves. That's really nice. And it's like soft and smooth. And if you look closely, you can see some like bubbles forming around the sides. That means that it has grown a little bit, has some air in there. So I'm going to go ahead and do my last fold. This is my 6th fold. So same thing that I've been doing all along, just kind of stretching it out, folding it over, turning it, doing the same thing 4 times. Feels really nice. All right, so at this point, what we're going to do is the pre-shape. So this is like a shaping that you do before the final shaping of the loaves. So I'm going to dump the entire thing of dough out onto my countertop here. I'm going to put a little bit of flour so it doesn't stick too much. And this is when I divide it in 2, because we're making 2 loaves here. So I forgot to mention this at the beginning. This is a nice tool to have. It's not like completely essential, but it is handy if you happen to have one. It's like a, I guess like a dough scraper, I think it's called. Bench knife? I'm not sure. But what I'm going to do is just cut it in half. If you don't have one of these, you can just cut it with a knife. Eye it up, get the most even halves that you can. I'm going to set this one aside for now. And what I'm going to do, try to not incorporate too much extra flour. I'm just kind of going to like make it into a little like couch here by sort of like pulling up the sides. And then turn it over, and with my bench knife, I'm going to like kind of scrape it like that. And when the dough kind of like sticks to the counter, it'll sort of anchor there. And what I'm trying to do here is just like build up some tension on the outside of the dough, which will become the crust. So basically I just want to kind of like form this into a ball that has like some tension on the outside. So I'm just going to do this a little bit. And if you don't have one of these tools, you can also just do this with your hands. But at the end of this pre-shape, it should be a nice kind of smooth outside. You don't want to do it too aggressively because there's some nice bubbles in there, air bubbles, that I'm kind of trying to preserve at this point because I want to have some bubbles in my final loaves. But that looks pretty good. It's like a bit smoother on the outside. Yeah, I've got some nice tension there, so that'll help it keep the structure when it bakes. So I'll do the same thing to the second loaf, and then I'm just gonna put some flour on top and put a cloth to cover it, and just leave it for 20-30 minutes or so, and then we'll come back and do the final shape. Okay, I'm back here and I'm ready to do the final shaping. So at this point, I just basically want to get some nice structure and get it into the final shape that I want the dough to bake in. So turn it over. There's a little bit of flour on the bottom there so it doesn't stick too much. First thing, I'm going to pull this bottom edge out, fold it over a third. Same with the left. Pull it out, fold it over a third. And with the right, sort of like you're folding like an envelope kind of thing. And then the top, I'll pull this out and fold it over. Get as much tension as you can there. So I have kind of a nice little package here. And I think I need a little more flour. So I'm just kind of gonna like turn it over with the sealed side on the bottom and do a little bit of like this, kind of scooping it together a little bit, just to sort of make sure that it has the shape that I want it and that it's nice and sealed on the bottom. So that is the final loaf. I'm gonna let it rise in my proofing basket, but if you don't have a proofing basket, you can also do what I did with this other one, which is just take a bowl, put a towel in it. Whichever one you choose to do, you're just gonna want to kind of sprinkle some flour pretty liberally into what you're going to be proofing it in. Proofing is another word for rising, by the way. So I have a good bit of flour in there, just so it doesn't stick. because that has been an issue for me in the past. And it really doesn't matter, with the final loaf, if you have some flour on the outside of the loaf, that's fine. Okay, so I put a nice bit of flour in there. And now with this loaf that I've shaped, I turn it over so that the side that I sealed is up and the nice side that will end up being the top of the loaf is down. Just because in the end I'm gonna dump this into my baking vessel, and so I want the bottom side to be up so that it's easier to dump. So I'm going to do that same thing with my other loaf here, and then I'm going to cover both of them and let them rise for 3 hours. You don't have to do anything for 3 hours, so this is a good chance to, go off and do whatever you need to do. So I'm going to do that, and we'll come back and talk again in 3 hours. Okay, my bread has risen pretty well. I'm still going to give it a few more minutes, but you can tell that it's a bit taller than it was before. The great thing about baking in the summer is that bread rises super well because it likes the heat. So, about 20 minutes before you're ready to bake, turn the oven on to 500 degrees, which is super hot, but that's what makes the best bread, is like a nice hot oven. And when you turn it on to 500, also put your pot in the oven at that point so you can get it nice and heated up, and put the top on it as well. If you don't have a Dutch oven like this, you can just use a cookie sheet. Your bread might flatten out a little bit, but as long as you gave it good structure when you were doing the shaping, it should be fine, so don't worry about it too much. The Dutch oven is nice just because it gives a little extra steam when you put the top on. It kind of like steams it up in there so that it produces a nicer kind of crispier crust. So I'm going to go ahead and get the pot in the oven, give it another 20 minutes, and then we will be ready to stick the bread in the oven. All right, it's time to get this bread in the oven. So I should mention that at this stage, if you like your bread a little bit more sour, you can leave it to rise a little bit longer. The longer that you let it rise, the more sour it's going to be, the more flavor it's going to develop. I'm going to make a loaf that probably isn't super sour, so I've just been letting it rise for like 3 hours. So I'm going to go ahead and bake it now. Okay, so I have my oven super hot. So at this point, you want to be super careful because the pan in there is really, really hot. And so I have everything ready. I have my razor that I'm going to use to score the bread with. And I have the hot pads, and I've got my dough right here, which is looking great. So hopefully it won't stick. That's kind of the only issue at this point, is if it sticks to the cloth that it's in. But let's give it a go. So I'm going to try to work quickly here, but I'll show you what I'm doing. All right, so I'm going to open it up and just dump this loaf right in there. And then we're going to put my razor. Here it is. Okay, so I'm going to take my razor and do a score, and I'll show it to you in a second. You want to score it pretty deeply. If you don't get a deep enough score on the bread, it will not rise properly in the oven. So basically, the score allows it to like spring up once it's in the oven. I'll show you what I did. So I just did like a basic square. That's kind of the easiest one to do. And you'll see as it bakes that the score will develop these ears. It's hot. Okay, put the lid back on. Now my hot pot is super hot. All right, and then just put it back in the oven. I'm just doing one loaf at the moment. You can either do one loaf at a time, or if you have two pots, you can, use both of them. So the trick is that once you put it in the oven, reduce the temperature to 450 right away. This is going to create some steam in the oven, that reduction in temperature that will start forming that nice crust on the outside of the bread. The other thing that will produce that nice crust is the steam that's inside of the Dutch oven. Because we put the top back on, it's gonna produce a really nice kind of like crispy crust. So I'm gonna let it bake like this with the top still on the Dutch oven for about 20 minutes, and then I'll take the top off. But I'll get back to you then. Okay, we're ready to take the top off of the lid and kind of see how the bread is starting to look in the oven. So I'm just gonna do that real quick and I'll give you a little peek. Alright, it's starting to look really good. It definitely needs some more browning, so I'm going to put it back in the oven for about 20 minutes or so. At this point, I'm just keeping an eye on it. Once it starts to look pretty brown, I'll take it out. But it is nice for it to be like fairly brown, not just kind of golden. I sometimes like almost burn it, like not quite, but like get it to a pretty nice dark brown, because that'll make a nice crust. So check back in a sec. All right, I think our bread is ready to come out of the oven, so let's check it out. Oh yeah, this looks really good. Look at that. That's gonna be so good. Sliced up with a tomato on it, maybe some cheese. So that is how you make sourdough bread. It's a long process, but at the end of it, it's super rewarding. And so I hope you guys maybe got a little bit interested in sourdough. You may try it once and decide it's not for you, but give it a go and let us know if you have questions or anything. You can always just call the library or comment on our Facebook post. So happy baking! Thanks for joining me.